Welcome, dear students. Today my topic for deliberation is Benedict Anderson and his imagined communities. In this lecture, I will focus on a number of objectives. Benedict Anderson and his academic work, his concept of nationalism and relevance of his theory on nationalism at the contemporary times. Benedict Anderson was an established academic with many important works to his name and had a significant contribution with deep knowledge of history and politics. Anderson's academic interest in the Southeast Asia region, particularly in the military conflicts between Cambodia, Vietnam and China in the late 1970s, stimulated him to analyze the importance of and political attraction to nationalist politics. The result was Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism, in which Anderson proposed the theory of imagined communities. It is currently one of the most frequently cited texts in the humanities and social sciences, and it is an important reference point in ongoing scholarship and debate. Since its publication, Imagined Communities has sold over 250,000 copies and has been published in 29 languages in 33 countries. Imagined Communities begins with three paradoxes. Nationalism is a modern phenomenon, even though many people think of their nations as ancient and eternal. It is universal. Everyone has a nation, even though each nation is supposedly utterly distinctive, and it is powerful, so much so that people will die for their countries, even though on close inspection it is hard to define. Major theoretical approaches Anderson maintained had largely ignored nationalism, merely accepting it as the way things are. Nation, nationality, nationalism all have proved notoriously difficult to define, let alone analyze. In contrast to the immense influence that nationalism has exerted on the modern world, plausible theory about it is conspicuously meager. Anderson believed that liberal and Marxist theorists had neglected to appreciate the power of nationalism. Unlike most other isms, nationalism has never produced its own grand thinkers, no Hobbes, Marxes or Webers, he wrote. Imagined Communities argues that the invention in the 15th century of the printing press, a movable type machine that allowed for the cheap mass production of books, radically transformed society in ways that helped create the modern nation and nationalism. Prior to this, books were produced by hand and usually written in Latin, making them too expensive and linguistically inaccessible to ordinary people. However, the mass production of books made them suddenly affordable, and local vernaculars or languages gradually overtook Latin in print. This allowed speakers of diverse local dialects to communicate and understand each other, which resulted in ways of thinking. Later, the printing press allowed the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers to reach audiences beyond the noble elites and the clergy. Anderson also sees a change in the popular notion of time as a result of both the decline of religion that came with Enlightenment thought and the new availability of reading material after the advent of the printing press. With authority of time as presented in the Bible, now subjected to skepticism or seen at least as less literal than before, a more standardized concept of time based on the clock, calendar, books, and newspapers filled this void of continuity. This allowed individuals to identify with others outside their immediate surroundings and to create imagined communities with territorial limits set by shared language and official state time. Anderson explains that these new identifications formed an imagined, inherently limited and sovereign political community in which members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. In Anderson's interpretation, common people could now feel pride or shame in the actions of others in a much wider sphere beyond the people they know and outwards into the imagined community or nation. Shared secular time and an accessible common literature helped foster a sense of loyalty so great that where people were once willing to die in the name of religion, as in the medieval European military incursions in the Middle East known as crusades, they were now willing to give up their lives for their nation. Imagined communities made several important and unique contributions to the field of nationalism studies. Before Anderson, no scholar had linked capitalism, an economic system based on private ownership, private enterprise, and the maximization of profit, print language, and nationalism in such a coherent way. This account of the link between technology, ideology, and social change also considers individuals profound emotional bound to their nation and their willingness to sacrifice themselves in its name. While this has been addressed by other scholars, such as the nationalism scholar Anthony Smith, the way that Anderson describes nationalism as a social construction for political and economic ends is original. The scope and perspective of imagined communities work have had a lasting effect on its field. It focuses on nationalist movements in parts of the world that had previously been ignored, representing a significant and timely break in the Eurocentrism of nationalism studies, that is, the tendency of nationalism studies to address predominantly European issues. Similarly, while most scholars argue that nationhood started in Europe, Anderson turns this assumption on its head and asserts that it is originated among European descendants in the Americas. According to Anderson, settler nationalists used language to build communities to challenge what they saw as imperialist oppression. This triggered the European powers to develop an official nationalism, which was a reactionary counter-narrative aimed at safeguarding their domination. These ideas paved the way for further research on the relationship between European colonizers and Third World nationalism. Finally, Anderson's book described the nation as an inherently limited and sovereign imagined community, and unlike the work of other modernists, distinguished nations by the ways in which they are imagined. Significance of imagined communities. Imagined communities represents one of the cornerstones of modernist thought in nationalism studies. Modernists reject the view put forth by pre-modernists that nations are natural and date back to the beginning of time. They also reject the perspective of ethno-symbolists that modern nations and nationalism stem from the pre-modern era, roughly the period between 1500. In contrast, modernists view the nation as a political and social creation that evolved alongside capitalism from the 16th century onwards. Anderson links the development of capitalism and print language with the decline of religion. European dynasties and imperialist culture, the culture of empire building through colonial conquests, to explain how nations and nationalism have evolved in the modern era. He does this in order to address what he perceives as a shortcoming of Marxist theory. Karl Marx, the founder of Marxist thought, was an internationalist who called on workers everywhere, regardless of nationality, to unite on the basis of class interests to overthrow capitalism, their common enemy. Anderson finds this problematic. Since 1945, he points out, Asian socialist revolutions, popular uprisings that draw on Marxist economic theory have been based on a discourse of nationalism and national heroes rather than class struggle, the latter term referring very roughly to the conflict of interest between working people and the wealthy who govern. For 3 decades, imagined communities has provided a springboard for research and debate within academia and beyond. Today, it remains one of the most frequently cited texts in the humanities and social sciences. It continues to play a leading role in the evolving understanding of nationhood and remains an essential read for students in many disciplines. In the academic world, the text normally either serves as literature on which to build a similar argument that nations and nationalism are social construction of the modern era, or it provides a starting point for those who wish to refute aspects of Anderson's argument. Anthony Smith is one example of a scholar who takes issue with Anderson and claims that nation and nationalism stem from pre-modern conditions. Furthermore, because of Anderson's interdisciplinary focus, that is, the way in which he draws on the aims and methods of different academic fields in the course of his research and analysis, imagined communities has proved indispensable to thinkers in a range of disciplines from anthropology to post-colonial studies. Consequently, it remains an essential read for students in different academic disciplines, particularly nationalism studies, and for general readers looking for different ways of understanding nations and nationalism in the modern era. The work in its context. Benedict Anderson is a historical materialist, a thinker who focuses on the relationship between social change and the economic material conditions within a given society, as well as on the relationship between social classes. His regular references to the power of print capitalism, a concept he uses to describe the conditions under which imagined communities, nations became possible, reflects his understanding of the role played by technology and press in dividing industrial societies into 2 basic groups: those who control the means of production, the resources and tools required to manufacture goods, and those who sell their labor power and produce goods, workers. In this sense, he attributes important transformations in social institutions and in the evolution of ideas to economics and class struggle. At the same time, he describes nationalism in cultural terms. Imagined communities was an attempt within the broader context of the Cold War, the period of tension and ideological conflict between the United States and Soviet Union that so marked the world between 1946 and 1991 to link theories of nationalism with Marxist. He did this in order to challenge Euro-American imperialism, the cultural and economic empire building of the United States and Europe, and represent voices that he felt had been neglected by Eurocentric scholarship that focused almost exclusively on issues that concerned Europe. In imagined communities, Anderson aimed to build on the Scottish nationalist theorist Tom Narayan's seminal work, The Breakup of Britain, Crisis and Neo-Nationalism, by attempting to close a long-standing gap between Marxist theory and nationalism, an issue he felt Marxists had historically elided rather than confronted. In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels argued that the working classes have no country and must unite across national borders against the common enemy, capitalism, the economic system in which resources and industry are held in private hands. This, in Anderson's view, overlooked the power of nationalism as a uniting force. Anderson's imagined communities is modernist in that it challenges those who argue that nations stem from the pre-modern period. However, Anderson differentiates himself from his modernist colleagues by linking nations and nationalism to the illusion of print language and anti-colonial resistance in Americas. Imagined communities is also a constructivist text in that Anderson portrays the formation of nations as an evolving process of identity formation, socially constructed through two interlinked factors: human agency or influence and structural conditions. For constructivists, these two concepts can only exist together. Take language for example. Established structures such as grammar and syntax exist. However, people ultimately sustain or modify these. One may sustain, for example, the sentence, "My son and I are teachers," or one might modify this incorrectly in slang as follows: "Me and my son are teachers." While conversations involve certain rules such as syntax that are necessary for us to understand each other, language can still be manipulated by the speakers. While structures influence behavior, they are sustainable and modifiable through human actions. Anderson also uses comparative methodology in that he analyzes different geographical contexts and looks at the ways in which nations, while they often model themselves on others, imagine themselves in different ways. Finally, some degree of institutional analysis through his portrayal of census, population surveys, maps, museums as tools used by European colonial powers to build the narrative of nation. They needed to counter the nationalism growing in colonial communities outside the mother country. Core question. The core research question Benedict Anderson poses in Imagined Communities is: why have all successful revolutions since World War II been framed in national terms rather than through a historical materialist or Marxist perspective centered on class struggle? In other words, why have nationalist ideas been more obviously important to these revolutions than ideas taken from the analysis of social and economic history outlined by Karl Marx. In his analysis, Anderson points to several geographical examples with a particular focus on Southeast Asian context. In his discussion of the power of nationalism, Anderson also addresses a number of key sub-questions. Among these are: where did nations and nationalism originate? Why and how did they evolve? Are they ancient or modern phenomena? What creates the profound emotional bond between individuals and their nations? How is nationalism reproduced? And what distinguishes one nation from another? Anderson asked these key questions against the backdrop of a resurgence of nationalism and ethnic conflict in different parts of the world, and an accentuation of ideological politics in the United States and the United Kingdom, where the right-wing political leaders Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were reshaping their nation's political, economic and social systems. In addressing these questions, the author concludes that nations and nationalism are wholly modern creations that stem from important political, economic, social and cultural transformations from the 15th century onwards. This position contributed to the growing body of modernist scholarship that challenged the idea that nations had existed since the beginning of time, or at least since the pre-modern era. By imagined, Anderson did not mean that nations are not real. Indeed, he wrote, any community larger than a village in which people know one another face to face is to an extent imagined. The deep horizontal comradeship that characterizes a nation is socially constructed, he wrote, but also heartfelt and genuine. It explains why people die and kill for their countries. While the preconditions were set in Europe, Anderson argued the development of national consciousness began in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States, Brazil and the former Spanish colonies in the late 18th century. From there, it spread to Europe and then to the former colonies of Europe in Africa and Asia. There is a counter perspective on identities too, which holds that identities are real and based on shared culture, language and historical linkages. In India, leading social scientist Dipankar Gupta had used the term ethnopreneurs to argue that certain leaders shape political discourses about ethnic identities and make them politically volatile only to use them for their own selfish interests to acquire power. Anderson at the contemporary times. In the post-Cold War period, there has been a surge of movements centered around ethnic identities. The world has witnessed bloody conflicts between ethnic groups in different countries. During this period, many hitherto dormant ethnic groups have become politically assertive and have claimed their rights to autonomy and sovereign nationhood. This process is likely to continue. Many countries in the world today are multicultural, multi-ethnic and multinational. These countries are vulnerable to assertive identity politics. Hence, they will have to demonstrate resilience and wisdom in accommodating growing demands for autonomy by various ethnic and cultural groups and working out a structure of power sharing through various means: federal reconstitution of power, devolution, consociation, politics, etc. This modern world is infinitely more connected than the one Anderson set out to describe, but it still holds similar ingredients. Gone are the printed books and the newspaper as the key mediums of the imagined community, as these forms of print culture have been replaced, although not entirely, by the internet and a shared digital culture that reaches every corner of the earth. But written text, whether physical or digital, read, watched or listened, remains as a catalyst and expression of the human impulse to connect and communicate. In this way, digital culture may allow new possibilities for individuals to imagine themselves as part and participant in an international community united in the reading or watching of content describing common events at regular intervals. Does this integration awaken the possibility of an imagined community on a global scale? And is this community already in force as evidenced by organizations like the United Nations, the World Court, the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization? Has internationalism, globalism and metropolitanism awoken us as citizens of the world, or is the recent rise of parties running on nationalist platforms a sign that the world is still held in the thrall of national sentiment? These identities and indeed these imagined national and global communities are held in tension. We are citizens of nations as well as occupants of this shared world, and while our cultures, languages and physical features alert us to differences, our humanity should remind us that we are all connected. We are all human, and as we struggle to cope with the damage of this virus on our bodies, minds and souls, perhaps we could endeavor to focus on our similarities, our shared hope, drawing strength from one another as we live through this historic moment of disruption. Thus, in concluding this reimagining of Anderson's imagined communities, we are left to consider whether the ends of nationalism may also be glimpsed in this conceptualization of its beginnings. Will the disembodied threats we now face force the emergence of a more unified, imagined global community reliant on shared digital and media cultures, or will we fall back on national imaginations? Whatever the case, it is clear that Anderson's work still has much to offer nearly 40 years after its original appearance in print. While still a graduate student, he published with Ruth T. McQuay a searing account of the Indonesian genocide of 1965-66, when after a failed coup, at least 500,000 Indonesians were massacred because of real or supposed links to the Indonesian Communist Party. Anderson's report helped undermine the official narrative of the coup. In retaliation, he was banned from the country in 1972 and returned only after the fall of the dictator Suharto in 1998. Anderson was renowned not only for his theoretical contributions but also for his detailed examinations of language and power in Indonesia, Thailand and the Philippines. He was fluent in Indonesian, Javanese, Thai and Tagalog. It was America's bitter experience in the Vietnam War and the clashes during that era among Vietnam, Cambodia and China, all communist states, that prompted Anderson's curiosity about the origins of nationalism. Among his many other works are a collection of essays on nationalism in Southeast Asia, an essay on the social forces behind a 1976 counter-revolution in Thailand, 3 years after a student revolt there toppled a military dictatorship, an analysis of the influence of anarchist ideas on Filipino nationalism, a travelogue about Wat Pai Rong Lu, a popular Buddhist tourist destination in Thailand that tries to depict what hell would be like, and several books on language, power, violence, and belief in Indonesia. At his death, Anderson had been finalizing an English translation of a memoir, A Life Beyond Boundaries, which was first published in Japanese. The book urges readers to resist the easy comforts of imagined homes, extols the joys of learning languages and of teaching and doing field work, and examines the new left's influence. Well, dear students, in this lecture I discussed with you Benedict Anderson's academic contribution, his much acclaimed work Imagined Communities, its significance. I also discussed his criticism to Marxist theory and relevance of imagined communities at the contemporary times, and much more. So, dear students, I hope you had enjoyed listening to me. Thank you.